Hello, this is Socially Triggered, and this video is going to be on how you can tell that the whole movement about climate change is a joke. Lately, we've been hearing Greta Thunberg and all these people going on about the climate emergency. And we know that it's not real because really, if you listen to what they're saying, it has nothing to do with about the climate. It's usually about, promoting socialist ideas. And I kind of thought about 8 points that really show the flaws in the way that they think and the flaw in the whole argument that they're making about the environment, and that they really don't care about the environment. If they really truly cared about the environment, we'd hear different things from them. But here's my points, and hopefully it'll make sense. It's not necessarily debunking any of the science or anything like that. It's more about just looking at their messaging and why their messaging is really false. So the first thing that they always go on about is that they're anti-nuclear. If you look at the Green New Deal, it actually does not allow for nuclear as an option. Well, nuclear technology, I'm actually a physicist in my background. Nuclear technology is actually the cleanest energy source that we have, because it's produces very little waste. They always go on about, oh, the waste will last like thousands of years and so forth. That's not really true. The waste, you can actually manage it, and the waste often is being used for cancer research and for cancer treatments. It's actually used in a lot of things. And the modern reactors, they actually can recycle the waste from nuclear power. So nuclear is actually the cleanest source of energy. It produces zero carbon when we actually produce energy from it. So it's actually the cleanest source of carbon that we have. Where all these other sources of energy, like solar and so forth, they're pretty dirty. So that's my next point. Wind. They're always pro-wind. Like if we just switch everything to wind, we'll be fine. Well, wind is not the greatest energy source. It takes several years before a wind turbine can actually balance out the cost of all the energy it took to get to that wind turbine stage. And as a result, it doesn't really produce that much energy. It only produces energy on windy days. And it's a bit of an eyesore. It has like issues with killing birds and electromagnetic waves and stuff. It's not a good source of energy. And even if they went totally wind, the amount of resources it would take to do that, to balance out our energy needs, would be just, it wouldn't make sense. It just wouldn't happen. Even with all the investment that they put into it, and they really put a lot of investment into it, it only produces like 3% of our total energy needs. It's like really, really minuscule. And it doesn't allow for a lot of the things that we need. Like energy from wind doesn't allow us to fly. It doesn't allow us to travel in cars. When people say, oh, I have an electric car, they're not using wind, they're using coal. Actually, most of the time, the electric cars, they run on coal. And why do they run on coal? Well, the energy that we use from the grid is usually from a coal-fired plants, or maybe some nuclear, and gas. So the point is, like, wind and all these things, not going to cut it. And the other thing is the pro-solar. Solar sounds great. We got the big sun there, and it's producing lots of energy. And that actually, the fact is, within 1 day of sunlight hitting the Earth, there's enough energy to power all of our needs for 1,000 years. One year of solar on the planet can produce enough energy for 1,000 years. So it sounds great. It's like this, wow, if we could just use that energy, we would never have to worry about energy again. But the truth is, it's not that good. The problem with solar is it's really, really dirty. It's a very dirty energy source, because to make those solar panels, what you do is you use rare earth minerals. And rare earth minerals you have to mine, and it's a very dirty extraction process to get those rare earths that you use to make the solar panels. And it's by far one of the dirtiest energy sources we have, and it's not very reliable. Sure, there's lots of light coming down, but it's inconsistent. It's spread out over the world. And cloudy days can take it down. Like, there's lots of issues with solar. So in theory it's good, but in practice it hasn't gotten there yet. There's a lot of issues with it. As I said, it's very dirty technology. My fourth point is they really don't understand carbon dioxide. So carbon dioxide is the greenhouse gas that they always point to. It is a greenhouse gas. It will actually trap heat into our environment, but it's not the actual leading source of that trapping of heat. Water vapor is actually more of an issue. The other thing is, what people don't realize about carbon actually is a greening thing. As you produce more carbon into the air, you actually encourage more greening of the earth. There's a satellite imagery done by NASA that if you look up global greening in NASA, you'll find that they actually show how the earth has become more green over the last few years as we produce more carbon. And that greening actually produces a cleaner environment. So the funny thing is, they always talk about, carbon as being this evil thing, but actually it's a greening gas, and it actually helps the world become a greener and healthier planet. And it's not the case that we're at the peak carbon dioxide levels we've ever been at. They don't understand this. The amount of carbon that we have in the air is actually not that much. It's a very small amount. We've actually been only like a few hundred years ago, or a few thousand years ago, we've had more carbon dioxide by a factor of 10 times as much as we have now. So this whole concept of carbon dioxide being this evil thing that's going to destroy our planet is a little bit sketchy. And if you really believe that carbon dioxide is the problem, then there's ways of actually doing what's called carbon sequestering, which you basically can pull out that carbon out of the air. And you can do it relatively cheaply. It's not that expensive thing to do, but it's not going to cost trillions of dollars. It's going to cost millions of dollars. And the thing is, all these environmentalists, they're really imposing things that will cost trillions of dollars. That you could actually solve so many of the world's problems with the amount of money that they're going to waste on these initiatives that really don't do anything. And that's what I'm talking about. This climate change movement isn't about actually making the world a better place, isn't about making the environment better or saving the planet. It's not about that. If it truly was, if they truly felt like that carbon was the problem, there's ways of doing it very, very inexpensively where we could actually save the planet. Remove the carbon from the air and do it relatively cheaply. But they're not serious, obviously not. They don't know the science. So that's my fourth point. My fifth point is they really do promote socialism. It's a socialist agenda. It's about getting government more control for the government. A lot of the times you'll hear about carbon taxes or cap and trade, or the idea of creating a carbon marketplace where you can exchange credits from different countries. This is really about government control. It's not about making the world a better place. It just doesn't even make sense. If you're just trading carbon between different places, then really are you trying to solve the problem of carbon dioxide? No. So totally not about actually solving any problem. It's about getting that government control so that they can control more business, they can control really every aspect of our lives, and getting that more globalist kind of idea where we have this one world government, which is a socialist government that controls every aspect of the people's lives. And if you know anything about socialist states, they have the worst environmental record for protecting the environment. I lived in a very socialist area when I was growing up, and the businesses that they put out of business, the government actually put these businesses out of business. They bought them, and they were actually very strict about the emissions that they could produce. They had scrubbers on their stacks. They had to produce waste in a very clean way, I guess, if that makes any sense. But once the government took over, we don't have to follow these same guidelines. They just polluted all the rivers. There's actually a 50% higher cancer rate in my hometown because of the government taking over these industries, where they just polluted, and the sky was always pink. It was horrible. And it's because governments don't care. they just see it as a way to create jobs, and they see it as a way to control things. And it's not about making the world a better place. It's not about that at all. It's about just controlling the people. And governments don't think about what's the best for the environment. They don't really care. They only care for votes. And so socialist governments have a tendency of being very, very dirty in terms of what they do to the environment. We think of, even like I was going on about nuclear earlier, and we think of where the worst nuclear accident happened. Well, it happened in Russia, where it was a government-controlled nuclear plant, and it melted down because they had no safety standards. They just wanted to produce energy. They wanted to produce it cheaply. They didn't really care about innovating to make it safe. And if you're a private business, you can't do that because you'll go out of business really quickly if you don't produce things carefully and to protect the people around, because you'll get sued, or things will happen where you'll go out of business. So you want to really produce it safe, and you want to make sure that that plant lasts a long time. So you'll produce it very safely. Governments don't care. They'll build another one, and so be it. Yeah. So the funny thing was, even that plant, Chernobyl, it actually operated for another 5 to 10 years after the nuclear meltdown. So most people don't realize that, and that's why I say nuclear is very safe. Even in the worst case example, the plant was still being used for several years after the accident. So misconception about nuclear, but not a misconception about how bad governments are. Another thing that a lot of these environmentalists they're very pro the idea of globalization and pro open borders, that we should allow refugees, they call them like environmental refugees, come from some third world country to our homes in North America and in Europe. And so basically you're taking people who come from a very small carbon footprint, and you're bringing them to a place where they're going to have probably about anywhere from 20 to 50 times the carbon footprint. So if you're really sincere about worrying about carbon dioxide and worrying about global warming and all these things, then you would definitely not want to encourage more potential pollution. You would want to make sure that maybe the numbers within North America get smaller and smaller and smaller, and the numbers in Europe get smaller, smaller, smaller. Any of the developed countries want to keep that number of people to a minimum, because we're the biggest users and producers of carbon. And things that you'd want to do is like just make sure that you really limit immigration. So you can't be both. You can't be saying, oh, we got to protect the environment and we got to watch carbon usage, and then you say, well, we're open borders. It doesn't work. It's just not practical because it's a contradictory thing. So whenever I hear that they're doing these big movements and big protests and stuff like that, and they say that they're pro-environment, fighting climate change, and then they say at the same time that they're open borders, well, then I know that they're not really sincere. So the other thing that I should mention in this, and this is my seventh point, is that they never mention India or China. India and China are by far the worst polluters. The big three, in terms of polluters and producers of carbon dioxide emissions, are China is number one, number two is the United States, and number three is India. And if you look at all the pollution that happens in the oceans, 80 some odd percent comes from India. Okay? It's insane how bad of a polluter India is and China. They're horrible. And now, if they're really sincere, they should be really protesting those countries and really saying, hey, those countries need to clean up their act and they need to really do something about those countries. If you look at the Paris Climate Treaty, they actually have provisions inside of that treaty to allow for both India and China to increase their carbon emissions by many times what their current rate is. Whereas everywhere else has to minimize their carbon thing. Well, if we did that, it would be like only a few years where all of a sudden you just have double the carbon being produced in India and China than the rest of the world. It would mess up things so bad. And there's no reason for it. If they're really sincere about trying to clean up the environment and protect the world from global warming, which I believe is sort of happening, but not quite for the reasons that they might think. If that's truly a problem, they would have to say, hey, look, let's do something in India. Let's do something in China. And they would look for ways to encourage those countries to really change their mindsets about how they produce energy, how they treat the environment. So that's one of the things that I always was bothered by. The last point that I'd like to make about the climate change, like, I don't know, there's a whole hysteria of it. And this is a way that I can always tell if they're really insincere, is they always mention the scientific consensus of scientists. So that is, whenever I hear that, I just go, oh, groan. Like, just like, it's so annoying because I know there is no scientific consensus on climate change. So the number 98% comes from actually three different groups. There's three different groups that actually came out with that crazy number of 98% of scientists agree that climate change is real, blah, blah, blah. Well, one of them was polling a whole, like, I think they polled like 10,000 scientists, which sounds like a good number. I mean, but there's millions of scientists out there, but they polled like a small segment of them. And then they polled them, and then they sort of threw out most of them because most of them didn't even answer the question. And then a small group of that small group answered the question. And then they phrased it in such a way that you could sort of say, well, yeah, climate change is real, but is it a disaster that was waiting to happen? Is the world going to end in 10 years? No. And only a few thought maybe it could potentially be bad. So it was not even the right phrasing of the question. So when you look at the numbers, they sort of phrase it like, do you believe that man has impact on climate change? Well, sure, I believe that. It's sort of like, do smokers have an impact on the environment? Probably. Any kind of release into the environment, well, it has some impact. And it's the same with climate change. There's probably some impact by man. And I'm not going to deny that. And most scientists don't deny it. But what is that impact? How much of an impact? Are there bigger things that have a much, much greater impact on the environment? And probably the answer to that would be yes. But they never ask that question. They always ask a very question that you can barely say no to. And the fact that 2% said no was kind of weird, actually. They should have all said yes, because it's sort of like kind of intuitive that you'd say, well, of course, man has some impact. We don't know what that impact is, but maybe some impact. But if you actually look at the science, you'll see that man's impact is very, very small, and much more accurate way of determining climate change is to look at solar patterns. The sun, as I said, does produce a huge amount of energy, and it's really what determines our environment and like how warm our planet is. And if you look, they always say, "Oh, this year is the hottest year on record," and that's another claim that they'll make, which is actually false. If you actually look at the historical data, if you go back 500 years ago, there was actually a point where the Earth was very, very warm. It was like they actually have streets named in England based on wineries, and they would produce grapes in England. You can't produce grapes in England now, but you could produce grapes in England 500 years ago, and because it was like the medieval warming period, and it was just sort of a time period where things were very warm, and there was no way that carbon dioxide, man wasn't really producing much carbon dioxide at that point, so you can't contribute it to man. So if you look at that period, well, it was very warm, and it was actually associated with some of the best times on the planet, where there was a huge amount of development. The Renaissance came out of it, where there was just this huge growth and huge abundance of things. They figured the temperature was maybe a few degrees warmer than it is now, like about 5 degrees warmer. So, if you look at Paris Climate Accord, they're trying to stay within 1 degree. Like they're planning on spending trillions of dollars to stay within 1 degree. And yet we know historically the world was actually better when it was 5 degrees warmer. So it just doesn't make sense. It's like all this stuff is just sheer nonsense. I always think about, some of those crazy religious cults. I'm going to say the Jehovah's Witnesses, and I have some friends that are Jehovah's Witnesses, and the funny thing is Jehovah's Witnesses, what they'll do is every so often they'll say the world's going to end. And they'll sell all their stuff and give it to the church, give the money to the church. And that's their way of getting into heaven, because the world's going to end anyway, so they don't need that stuff. And that way, if they donate a big amount to the church, then they'll be risen up in the levels of the church, and they can maybe get to go to heaven. That's what they believe. So so they do that every so often. They'll have a scare where they'll say, "Oh, the world's going to end this year, or within a few years it's going to end. You might as well sell all your stuff and donate it to the church." So it's sort of a scare that they'll do as a way of driving money towards the church. Well, this whole conspiracy, this whole thing with climate change is the same thing. It's a way of freaking out the masses and getting them to donate all their stuff, to make sacrifices that they would normally not want to do, all in the vain attempt to control something that they have really no control over. So a lot of this is just not. It's a joke. It's just it's a cruel joke that's being played on us by our governments, by these people who are activists that have their heart is in the right place. I believe that they actually have good intentions, but their mind is not. They don't know the science. They don't know what's going on in the world, and they're driven more by a socialist agenda rather than actual true concerns about the environment. So just quickly, my 8 points were: they're against nuclear, they're pro-wind, they're pro-solar, they don't understand carbon, and they're socialist, they're pro-open borders, and they always mention the scientific consensus, and they always ignore India and China and the impacts that they have. So that's my summary of why you can tell the climate change movement is a joke. I hope you enjoyed. This has been Socially Triggered. I'd love to hear your feedback. Thanks for watching.